Welcome everyone to this this gathering to talk about college and career training in Vermont, but really understanding and taking the time to explore what philanthropy might look like in this new landscape of learning as we see so many transitions occurring in the industry of higher education, and we see a proliferation of pathways and opportunities for young people to explore what might come next after high school. And we see so many different on-ramps and so many challenging off-ramps for people as we think about their social, emotional, economic, and civic development over time. I am Dan Smith. I'm president and CEO of the Community Foundation, and this event lands in a series of opportunities that we're putting forth for people who care about Vermont and are putting resources, time, effort, thought, and energy into issues that matter to Vermont communities to create the space to explore the ways in which that effort, that time, that energy, and those resources can drive the greatest impact. We really do see these as a series of community conversations in which we can learn collectively and develop our philanthropy over time, because there's no shortage of need and opportunity. I started at the Community Foundation 3 years ago, and we launched into an exploration of the role of a community foundation in closing the opportunity gap that existed in our state. And I want to ground that for a moment and then talk about this issue specifically. The opportunity gap is the set of circumstances that are dominant and at play in communities that really mean that your prospects economically, civically, and socially are in many ways driven by where you were born and who your family is, and they constrain the development of life over time. If you were born in 1940 in the US, you had a 90% chance of doing better than your parents economically. If you've been born since 1980, that prospect is 50-50, and so that's a coin toss. And so as we think about the next generation, we need to be thinking about whether a coin toss is good enough relative to the Vermont proposition and the American dream. And so we think about the opportunity gap and the role of philanthropy in addressing that coin toss. More specifically in Vermont, we know that, frankly, it's a challenging place to be a young person. We have the highest poverty rate among 18 to 34-year-olds in New England by 6 percentage points. They're almost, I think, 18%. We know that from the Public Assets Institute. We know that while the northwestern Vermont has recovered economically after the recession, most of the state still faces challenges that were driven by the recession recovering over time. So we've explored and developed a set of strategies to focus on the opportunity gap by looking at early childhood care and education through our partners at Let's Grow Kids and building a movement to close that gap, by supporting youth and families with the kind of environmental supports that young people need through their developmental years during their K-12 years, housing, addressing families stricken by substance use disorder, making sure that young people have healthy after-school programs and opportunities to explore their communities in Vermont where there literally isn't a place for young kids to go between 3 and 7 o'clock if they're not playing a sport after high school. And we need to be standing up and making sure those deserts don't exist. But the place where we lose the most young people is really the transition from college. And I'm not going to get too far into the data because I'm looking down the line of the panelists, and I know that the data, if I get it wrong, will get corrected pretty promptly. But if you think in terms of rough numbers of 100 kids who graduate from high school, there are roughly 60 who will continue their education after high school, but 30 of those will go out of state to do so. So the majority of kids are stopping out and exploring either not continuing their education or trying to figure out what the right next step is for them as the cost of education has grown. And so it shouldn't be lost on us that we're having this panel also and on the day in which CCV celebrated its 50th anniversary since its founding. And so the challenge I kind of want to put to the panel and the conversation and the group is knowing that 50 years ago, the community college model, as it were, was an innovative idea that was subject to a brainstorming session somewhere. What is that innovative idea? What is that pathway? What are the structures? And what's the role of philanthropy in answering that question? What is the role of us as a community of donors and a community foundation and a collective of foundations and a collective of funders in answering the question around what pathways need to exist for Vermont communities to be vital, because every young person has a pathway to learn how to do something they're going to get paid to do, to be productive and engaged civically, and to be a strong part of their community, and to be able to take care of their families economically, civically, and socially. Because if we don't get a handle on closing that gap, the decision to continue your education at high school, we're going to be facing long-term civic, social, and economic consequences. So this is really an opportunity. It's really an opportunity for us to come together, to listen to the stories of different ways people are navigating the decisions of how they come to what they want to learn and how they're going to get that education, and to learn from some practitioners in the field who are talking about different pathways, and then to challenge each other to explore what the role of philanthropy can be in standing up this new landscape of learning. You know, nationally, $50 billion of philanthropy goes to higher education. 48 billion of that goes to traditional four-year institutions. Of the 18 million students who are enrolled in college, only 3 million are enrolled in traditional four-year bricks and mortar academic institutions. So we have to challenge ourselves as philanthropists to really help set that table, to understand how these pathways are going to grow, evolve, and the fact that, and understand that a decade from now, people are going to be pursuing things and studying things in different ways and different tools from different organizations, in many ways from organizations that are evolving and adapting over time to respond to those needs. But I really do think we need to challenge ourselves. And so I'm gonna push everybody a little bit. I want us to be creative, and I want us to be thinking, because the traditional model is gonna evolve and change over the next decade. And if we don't get a handle on it in Vermont, and I think philanthropy has a crucial role to play in it in Vermont, we're gonna continue to see those long-term civic, social, and economic consequences, and we're gonna continue to wrestle with demographic challenges across the state and significant regional divides. So I'll pause there. I'm really excited for the conversation that you all are going to have. I'm really excited, and I want to welcome Fran Stoddard to facilitate. And I do actually have just one logistical thing I have to share, because the room's too small for me to do it anonymously. But I actually have another meeting I'm going to have to be at. And so I'm welcoming everybody, and I'm really excited for this discussion, but I am going to be ducking out in a few minutes. So thank you for taking the time out of your days and helping us explore how philanthropy can help close the opportunity gap by standing up and supporting different college and career training pathways for Vermont kids who can benefit from them. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Many thanks to Dan. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to give a quick preview of the day. We're going to move through this time very, very quickly, but it's packed full of information and great stuff. I first want to know that near the end, when we will probably break up into 3 areas, so think about this a little bit. One is funding students, individual students. The other is funding programs and projects, and Lauren, you kind of made me think about this. What are we going to be talking about later? And the other is more systems. You know, what systems and partnerships do we need to put in place? So as you're listening and are really get tuned into one thing or another, you might think about where you might land on one of those 3 groups. So I think we are very blessed to have 3 people. As you all know, life is busy, and we have 3 wonderful people who have given us some of their time today to voice what's going on for them. They're all students, and they're students in kind of a different way. And we're going to hear just a very short piece of their story, and we'll see if we have a little bit of time for, 1 or 2 questions for them. And hopefully, they'll stay for a little bit of of and be part of this afternoon as much as they can. So Rachel Cleveland, she works at Central Vermont Medical Center. She has her licensed nursing assistant degree, her LNA. I had to learn all of these LNA, LPNs. And she also works as a clinical care associate, but she is continuing her schooling while working towards her licensed practical nurse, her LPN and RN. So why don't you tell us a little bit better? You can tell your own story. Thank you, Rachel.
All right.
I think so.
Okay.
So my name is Rachel Cleveland. I'm in the Central Vermont Medical Center LNA to LPN program. She mentioned licensed nursing assistant. So I used to be a hairdresser, actually. I decided that I wanted to get into healthcare after my grandfather died, and I went to Woodridge, the nursing home that's affiliated with CVMC. They have ceremonies for those that have passed away, and the nurses all get to go up and speak about the residents that have passed and a little remembrance about them. And I attended that, and at the time was hairdressing, and I was watching all these nurses that got to go up and speak about all these people that they worked with. A lot of them didn't have family members, and they knew them so intimately, and they were such a big piece of their lives throughout their transition into death. And I thought that was something that I really was interested in and wanted to get into. So that week, actually, I went, and while I was still hairdressing, I went back to school and did a complete career change. Got my licensed nursing assistant certificate. I then started working at Central Vermont Medical Center in 2013 as a clinical care associate, which was a brand new position at the time. We work mainly in the medical group practices. We bring patients in, do intakes. There I got to learn a lot about medications and rooming patients and doing all of like the lab stuff they put me through, and got my phlebotomy certificate so I could now draw blood and learn the lab portion of things. So sorry, I'm kind of skipping ahead here. During that time, I found that this was my passion. I loved nursing, I loved working with people, and I loved getting to know them on a more personal level. So I decided that I really wanted to further that career and get into nursing. So I started taking classes at CCV. I was taking them online and just kind of plugging away at them one by one with the hopes of one day going to VTC and completing their nursing program. That was my plan until life happens. I had my son in 2016. His name is Colton. I also had 2 brain surgeries while working at CVMC. My first one was in 2015, and my second one was just last year. So all that was kind of happening. My son's father was not in his life for the first 2.5 years. He's currently in recovery from opiate addiction. So I'm going to try and get through this, okay? But he's now a year sober, and he's doing really awesome, and he's now in our life. But I was trying, there was so much going on, and there was no way that going back to school was an option for me. So it just kind of got pushed to the back burner. I was trying to kind of take a CCV class here and there, but at that point I was like, I'm never going to be able to do the nursing portion of it, because I'm never going to be able to do the practical part, because it just wasn't feasible. So Megan Foster from our Human Resources Department, I went to CrossFit with her, and she sent me an email and said, "Oh my God, we have this program coming out, and you have to learn what's going on." So CVMC is doing this program, the LNA to LPN program, so that I totally forgot these cards. I can now work 48 hours a pay period and get paid for 72. They're completely flexible with my schedule, so that I can now go to school and work and not have to have a full-time job and be in school full-time. So it's been pretty awesome. Right now I'm in the CCV portion, so we are doing our prerequisites before the VTC portion. So last semester was our first semester. I had already done some of the CCV classes, so I didn't have to take human growth and development. I chose to do it online as a refresher, because it had been a few years. But so we're now moving along, and then next year we have these practicals, and we'll be able to go to school. We are only allowed to work 48 hours, so I'll be working Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, have Thursday and Friday, most of Friday off with my son, and then go to school on Saturday and Sunday. So it's huge. It's been pretty life-changing as far as I can now go back to school and and still see my kiddo and be able to kind of further both my life and his. So, yeah.
Wow, what a story, huh? Thank you so much, Rachel. Very, very, very powerful.
I forgot the cards.
Well,
I get
sometimes writing out the cards means then you don't need them.
Right.
You've got them. So next up is R.J. Lacasse. He is a high school senior. He was at Lamoille High School, and he's from Hyde Park. But now he's in the 2-year diesel program at Randolph Technical Career Center, because that was his passion and what he wanted to do. So tell us how you got there.
I started out on a family farm, always grew up there. I got into diesel, helping my grandfather fix them. And then when I got into about the 10th grade, I figured that I wanted a program I could go into that I was interested in. So I found out about Randolph. So I went down there, and over the course of 2 years, I now have over 100 IRCs, industry-recognized credentials, including ASE and all the other big manufacturers. They provide OSHA 10, so many other things. We have guest speakers, and that's what led to actually my first job. Was I started out at Clark's Truck Center, and that's going really well. They're helping me with training. They paid for all my international and my Cummins training, so that's pretty big. And they're a good company. They let me expand.
So RJ, after RTCC, after you've done all this, and by the way, that booklet is full up with certificates, and that's just the half of them, if that, right? which is pretty remarkable, that a whole binder. Some of the people in your course actually might go on to college or might not. Could you just explain that and what you are thinking about?
Yeah, we had, there's 11 seniors. 10 of us are thinking about going to college. One of them actually got a good job into the state. And that's one big thing about that program is they set you up. I have 100 IRCs, but I also have 560 trainings. And when you go to a job interview and you show them that, they're impressed. So.
Awesome. And IRCs, which I learned, are industry recognized credentials, which you probably all know, but you could get a job many places even now, but even more as you continue on. Awesome. Thank you so much, RJ. Staci is with us. She's from Rutland, and she is studying to be a certified production technician, again through CCV, and at the same time is working a temp job in that field with GE. So why don't you tell us your story, Staci?
Sure. Staci Davis from Rutland, and when you guys were going around the room, if I thought what I could have said would it have been to be a light or to be able to help someone else and to tell you what you do or what you can do matters. I was a latchkey child from the 70s. I was a good girl in school. I got my diploma, but other than that, I had no direction. I had no guidance. I had no family support. I had nothing. So I just lived life and met my husband in Florida. And we moved up in 2000 to Vermont because his family was from up here. Unfortunately, he left our family after 13 years. And in October of 2013, I became a single mother of my 2 girls. And so I've just lived and loved and taken care of them and done the best that I can. And in August, this 2019 August, I was at CCV in Rutland. CCV to me is approachable. It's small, it's kind, it's inviting. I was there looking for what to do for my daughter because she's a senior this year. She's 18. And while I was waiting there was this man, and he was being talked to about a program for manufacturing that could lead to local jobs in the area. And GE was one of them that was mentioned. And a light bulb went off in that moment because I had always encouraged my ex-husband to try out for GE or try for this because I had heard that it was a good company. It was a long-standing company. It was a firm company. And so I was always about trying to do the best. And in that moment, I said, what about me? Why not me? Why couldn't I do that? And so while I was waiting for Tammy at CCB and to talk to her about my daughter's senior year, I said, there's this program that I heard about, and could you tell me more about it? And in that moment, she walked me through the program. I actually, from the Strengthening Working Families Initiative, applied for that, and I wouldn't be here today if there wasn't a program that actually supported me. I wouldn't be here right this moment. So the program makes it possible for you to learn the manufacturing part and to be able to apply that in a local job. And so classes started in the fall, and I got in right away. And I just finished my first one in December. And they actually had a panel that came with a few local hiring companies, and they wanted to hear who we were, and we could hear who they were. And it also went to a field trip that landed at GE. And while we were at GE on the field trip, there was a person from the hiring temp agency that said, we take kindly to hiring from this production technician program, and you could even do that while you're in class. And what we do caution you to do and ask you to do is don't give up on your certificate, continue through class. So when I heard that I could work for it and train for it, I jumped on that. And I applied, and they actually accepted me. So I am hired at GE through the temp agency currently. And what I learn in class helps me in the job, and what I'm learning at the job is helping me in the class. And so it's just to be able to learn the skills that I didn't even know that I could do. It was the self-confidence, it was the self-esteem, it was the ability to provide for my children and learn more so that I could do that.
Staci, thank you so much. These are powerful stories. This is really what we're here for today. We're going to do a switch in just a second with the other panelists, and we're just only barely over time. Any burning questions, but you can also hold them for the whole panel, all 7 of them, after. How about an applause for these 3 remarkable students? Thank you so much. So what we're going to do is our 4 panelists from here are going to come up and sit where you are, and you 3 are going to move. Roxanne Vogt, she's the Deputy Director of Advance Vermont, which is a statewide initiative to grow the number of Vermonters with education and training after high school. Roxanne weaves together experience in higher education and business development together to experience higher education and business, did I just say that? Higher education and business development to lead Advance Vermont in bringing visibility to non-degreed credentials and support the institutions and systems that make them accessible. She's going to present us with a really broad overview of the current climate in Vermont for post-secondary education and training, and some of her materials, which are terrific, are on your table, so you might want to get those out. Go ahead, Roxanne.
Well, thank you, Fran and Carolyn and Dan and everyone for having me this afternoon. I'm going to start out with a broad overview of the post-secondary landscape to give you some context for the conversation this afternoon. So right now, across the nation, states are looking at educational attainment as a key strategy for increasing individual prosperity, making communities stronger, and increasing economic growth as a whole. And so we have peers across the nation who are doing very similar work to Advance Vermont. They've set ambitious state-level goals, and they're tracking progress with interim measures from everything such as preschool enrollment to who is not participating in career and technical education, to how many of their states' high-demand, high-growth jobs are matching up with the programs that are offered by their in-state institutions. So they're also investing significant dollars and resources into tools and systems and campaigns and measures to look at the success of that work and what needs to change. And they're doing this because the status quo isn't working. They're looking at their employers' needs, they're looking at their individual citizens' needs and the needs of their communities and realizing that something needs to change. So here in Vermont, we're all very familiar with some of our challenges, particularly around workforce for this audience. But I did want to highlight just a few of the factors that are really critical to consider as we have this conversation. So the first is demographics. We have, yes, an aging population, a low birth rate, rural outmigration, and declining school-age population. And all of this yields, I don't say that just to be a sort of naysayer, but rather that all of this yields a shrinking labor pool. So what's happening now is you have folks who are surfacing within the labor pool who have barriers to employability. So they're in recovery, they have a past of incarceration, there are maybe they're individuals with disabilities, they have barriers to access because they live in a rural part of the state, they don't have access to broadband, they can't do a distance job, a remote job. We also have an educational pipeline that isn't seamlessly converting folks from K-12 to post-secondary learning. So we have one of the highest graduation rates in the country from high school, and yet a relatively low continuation rate on to post-secondary learning opportunities. We also have challenges for our providers of post-secondary education and training. There are issues with keeping pace with the high demand of industry to have rapid change. There are challenges with keeping pace with technology. And there are social changes. There are changes within the individuals who are interested and able to participate in these programs. And it's challenging for an institution to keep pace with all of that change. We also have historically low public investment in higher education in Vermont. And we also have a governance structure for career and technical education at the secondary level that disincentivizes collaboration between the high school sending schools, as they're called, and the local tech centers. And then we have a dominating public narrative around the value of post-secondary education and training, in particular college. People say it's not worth the investment, or it's not for me. There is a lot of messaging out of there that we can work to correct. And then there's the issue of how employers are marketing the offerings that they have in terms of jobs and careers. How are they describing those opportunities? Are they putting very clearly forward that your investment in a quality credential will have a huge return? So we have some work to do in terms of the work that how employers are marketing their opportunities and how they're perceiving them to be of value. And then there's also urgency, incredible urgency. So if you look at some of the recent surveys from employer organizations, so Davis and Hodgson does an annual report, Main Street Alliance does a biannual policy report where they poll small businesses in the state, and Vermont Business Roundtable does a quarterly economic index that measures how employers are feeling. You look at those reports, and over the past 10 years consistently, being able to attract and retain quality employees is a top concern for employers, along with, to be fair, healthcare costs and taxes. Those are the top three. So we have urgency, we have some knowledge of the demographics, but we also have a huge opportunity. So we, in July of 2019, were able to get a newly codified post-secondary attainment goal for Vermont. So we now have a truly aspirational goal that we're all working toward, but one that motivates us all, and that is to get to 70% of Vermont's working age population, so those who are 25 to 64, to some type of credential of value by 2025. So we're currently at 50%, which is a measurement that comes nationally, but is well respected. And we want to get to 70%. So 70% of Vermonters having a credential of value by 2025. I want to talk a little bit about language. So credential of value is a term that has a formal role within this post-secondary attainment goal, but it doesn't yet have a formal definition. So the one that we're working with currently is a degree, a educational certificate, an occupational license, a registered apprenticeship, or an industry-recognized certification that has value in the workforce and demonstrates competency in technical or occupational skills. So we're working towards a definition that we can all rally around, but for the meantime, in this conversation in particular, I think that we can feel safe with those being the qualities that we're looking for in a true credential of value. So these are complex systems that we're talking about, and I find that it's helpful to think about framing the work with three questions. And the first is, what is the impact that is had on an individual, a community, and the economic growth of the state when one Vermonter attains a credential after high school? The second is, where can we invest in our energy and resources best to have the greatest impact? And then, who do we need to engage and how? So, in terms of investment, for the return on investment for a Vermonter getting a post-secondary credential, between income, payroll, property taxes, and sales tax revenue, someone with the equivalent of a 4-year post-secondary degree generates more than twice the income of someone who just has a high school diploma. So that's a degree-specific stat, but quite an impressive one, 4 times the monetized value. And then there are correlations with non-monetized benefits, so lower incarceration rates, lower dependence on social safety nets, better health outcomes, more civic engagement, involvement in volunteering, voting, charitable giving. And then beyond this, for the individual, that person is likely to have higher wages, in some cases a more consistent and dependable work schedule. You probably heard of the challenges for some part-time employees who don't have dependable schedules and have to juggle that, as well as having a perceived higher quality of life and often employer-sponsored benefits. For employers, you're all very familiar with the work of the McClure Foundation and the Department of Labor to document the number of high growth and high wage jobs and the education and training requirements for those jobs. And when we look at that data, 100% of the high demand, high growth jobs require education and training after high school. 80% of them require a credential of value. So it's very clear what the need is and what the return is when we make these investments. Where exactly should we make those investments? So I mentioned Vermont's newly codified educational attainment goal, and the law also has 4 key priority areas that the state has identified to focus on. The first is to promote awareness of career pathways and the value of post-secondary education training. So I see that as a messaging focus, a communications focus, a changing of the narrative. I would add, if I had been in charge of that language, that I would talk about the diversity of post-secondary pathways. That's very critical to what we've been talking about here today. We also are focusing on expanding access to students of all ages and recognizing that people are coming to these opportunities from different backgrounds. We want to increase the number of those who are completing the programs. It's one thing to get them into the program, but if they're not receiving the support they need, or it's not customized toward their interests and abilities, they won't necessarily be successful. And we need to maximize the partnerships that we have within education, training, and employment-focused organizations, and all of those participating in Vermont's education and workforce development system to truly be collaborating and working together toward a unified set of goals. So that's all wonderful, and there's some kernels in there for sure, but I would be remiss if I didn't highlight 2 things that are critical to the success of all of this work. We will not achieve anything if we don't address the fact that there is inequitable access and opportunity for post-secondary learning. And the other is that we have to address the stigma surrounding non-degree pathways. Without those 2, we will never get to anything close to 70%. So good news, we have new data about the needs and experiences of today's students, and you have a handout in front of you, I believe. It's highly visual. There's 4 areas that we've identified. This is research that came from Advanced Vermont in fall of 2019. And there are 4 areas that we identified as being true characteristics of today's students. So those who are participating in post-secondary programs now or have recently graduated from them. So they are that these Vermonters have responsibilities that are beyond their educational focus. They're older, they're parenting, they're working. They need flexibility. More than half of them commute. Nearly 1 in 3 attend part-time. And they're often financially independent in ways that affect not only their ability to pay for tuition, but also non-tuition expenses such as textbooks, fees, and so on. And this also affects their ability to have secure housing and food security. And then lastly, there are identities and lived experiences that these students are coming to post-secondary learning with that have to be accommodated. Some are veterans, some are new Americans, some are the first in their generation, first in their family to be going to college or pursuing a non-degree pathway. And the way they're entering into our system is different for those who are not in those situations. So I might leave it there and just say there's more that we could go into, but I'll leave you with just 2 projects that are of importance. And they're examples of how those stakeholders are working together. So Advanced Vermont is rolling out a public communications campaign that's going to be focusing on changing the narrative, as I spoke about earlier. We've also recently released a data dashboard, which is available on our website, advancedvermont.org, and that's tracking 26 metrics around how are Vermonters doing with aspiration, with participating in these programs. Are they affordable? Who's completing them? And are they aligned with labor market demand? And then we're also rolling out an education, training, and employment portal this year in 2020 with lots of the partners in this room. And we'll be building upon this research that you have in front of you to continue to tease out the needs of Vermonters today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roxanne of Advance Vermont. Terrific. Now Roxanne gave us that big overview of reminding us a lot about what's going on, what's the climate here, what do we need to think about. The rest of our distinguished panel get less than half that time. That's what we've told them, because we'll also have a more robust discussion and we'll open up the questions to you. So we have challenged them with this and we'll see what happens. We also have kind of looked at, what perspective can they represent? And we have the student perspective, the provider perspective, and the employer perspective. Now know that all 3 of these can come from any of these perspectives. They are truly, they know this area very, very well. But for the sake of it, right now we're going to go to Scott Giles for the student access perspective. He is the president and chief executive officer at the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation. Mr. Giles, Scott is an expert on federal student financial aid policy and has devoted his career to expanding access to education and training after high school for students of all ages. He writes and speaks extensively on this stuff. So welcome from VSAC, Scott Giles.
Fran, thank you very much. And boy, is it humbling to pretend to offer a student perspective after following the panel. So I'm hoping, yeah. So I'm not going to do what I was told to do in part. I'll try and balance what I think is the perspective that we have learned from students and balance both institutional and system issues that I think will need to be addressed through the course of this. And I think some of the stories that you all have shared with us a little bit to highlight what I think are some of the challenges and opportunities that we face in this space. So sticking to my 5 minutes, there are some things that I want to do, which is take a look at a consumer's perspective in the role of counseling, talk a little bit about financing and affordability, and then talk about accountability and quality, because I think these are 3 things broadly speaking that we'll need to think about, and we'll probably share more in the Q&A. So as Roxanne has already laid out, this is a really important area, organizationally from a state perspective. There's some new data that just came out using a different methodology that took a look at what percentage of employment was going to require education or training after high school. 70% is the number that is projected for 6 years from now. That's also the percentage of the workforce that needs education and training after high school today. Of that 70%, about 40% is projected to need a 4-year degree or a graduate degree, and that remaining 30% will require some form of education or training after high school or an associate's degree. And that's really what we're here to talk about. One of the things that, at VSAC, we've been around since 1965, and we were really created initially as the financial aid organization. And we learned pretty quickly that we can offer aid, but if we don't provide a counseling structure, the students of all ages that we are trying to serve can't access either the financing, the career counseling, or the education and training. And one of the things that I wanted to do if I were in a position where I could ask questions, at each point, our panelists beforehand described a juncture in which they found a resource or found a person. And some of that was structured and some of that was haphazard. And the thing that I want to leave everybody with is that as we look at the proliferation of credentials of value and the availability of offerings for non-degree credentials, that complexity creates its own challenges for the students that we're trying to serve. And we need to think about how it is that we are going to make sure that they have access to the full range of career and education and training counseling that they're going to need to both achieve their goals, access the right education or training program, and then pay for it. And this is hard work in part for some of the reasons that Roxanne touched on that I just want to kind of highlight a little bit for. One, value can be measured in multiple and many different ways, and it's something that we think about in this space. I'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about some of our role in financing. Some credentials have value because they're industry recognized. Some of them have value in the context of a post-secondary degree. In our non-degree grant program, working with New Americans, one of the credentials that we help support is a driver's license, because accessing driver education, if you are a non-English language learner, is nearly impossible. And in this state, unless you live in the right location, accessing work without a car is nearly impossible. So that credential has value, and important value to them. And that's something that we need to think about as we think about kind of credentials. Are credentials stackable? One of the things that this is, higher ed talk, but really, I think when Rachel was talking about your progression through this, starting as an LNA and then looking at subsequent, LPN and then nursing, each one of those credentials that you obtain is recognized as having value for the next step that you are looking at pursuing. And one of the things I think we want to consider is whether or not we can break down this dichotomy between a credential of value and a degree, because each one of those things could, if we structured them appropriately, and CCV, VTC, and others are doing some really interesting work in this area, be something that is recognized as having value and can lead to and support additional education or training down the road as that education or training becomes important or valuable, much like Rachel is doing right now. And then I think the last part on this topic that I wanted to touch on was, as you were hearing, as we think about education and training, we need really to take seriously something that we've talked about for years, which is the importance of lifelong learning. That these are not going to be moments in which we step into an education or training program once, but as the world of work changes, each one of us is going to have to find a way to be able to get the training or the education or the certificate of value that they will need to adapt with the workforce and the workplace. Financing. A couple things that I just want to touch on. One, I need to give a shout out to Amy and our friends at Curtis and Hale Family Foundation for the contribution they just made. Vermont was actually one of the first states in the country to create a grant program targeted towards adults to support their access to certificates of value. It was called the non-degree grant. And this year we'll make about 2,000 awards about a little under, 3.4, $3.5 million. And one of the challenges we have there is this is the fastest growing high demand area that we as an organization face. It's not that we have enough money in other areas, but this is an area that is growing so rapidly. Demand grew by 25% over the last 3 years, and you think about that in the context of our demographics, that gives you a perspective on how active that area is. And as I mentioned, Curtis has been a great partner with us and allowed us to partner with them in the creation and the administration of a Certificate of Value Scholarship Program to supplement the resources that are provided by the state. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is accountability. This is, now I'm wearing my systems hat, but it's also a student perspective. There's a lot of activity happening in the space of certificate of value. And one of the things that we learned through administering the grant program was that as more dollars flowed into this space, more providers or more entrepreneurs started looking at ways that they could provide education or training, credentials of value. And not every provider had the resources or the knowledge or the expertise to provide a high quality program. In the degree space, we as an organization, when we're awarding grants and scholarships, rely fairly heavily on regional or national accreditation. But in this space, that's not always available to you. Sometimes it's a provider like a tech center or a group that is providing an industry recognized credential. But other times it's not, and it's unclear. And this has actually forced us to go in and develop some of our own criteria for evaluating providers. So I want to offer that thought at the system level because that's important both in terms of stewardship of dollars and in counseling students to make sure that in the end, when they make their investment in their own treasure and time, that they are getting the education or training that they really need. And then my last thing that I want to close on is just a reminder of the importance of this work, both from a state level and from a philanthropic perspective. These students are amazing, right? And can you imagine, given the things that they have tackled, that they described for us today, what it is that they will be able to do once they have the education and training that they need in order to perceive their goals. So congratulations and thank you for sharing your stories.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to the provider perspective. It's terrific, of course, to have Joyce Judy here, and congratulations on your 50th anniversary. It's really awesome. She is the president, of course, of the Community College of Vermont. A special focus of her work is expanding access to higher education for all Vermonters, from high school students taking college courses to adults seeking new career opportunities. She has overseen the development of a broad number of workforce education programs and has certainly been a statewide leader in increasing the number of students who continue their education after high school. Joyce, thank you for being here.
Thank you, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, we did celebrate our 50th. And I also want to give a nod to Tim. Tim and I have worked together for many, many years. Tim was a key, played a key part in the development of CCV. So thank you, Tim. As we think about this, and when you hear Scott talk, Vermont. And I would say CCV, what's critical to our work is partnerships. Vermont is such a small place that we can't do our work without really strong partnerships. So when I talk about a lot of the stuff that I want to share with you this afternoon, it's really, it's not just CCV, it's the work we do with, I always think CCV is so uniquely positioned because we work a lot with K-12. We work a lot with bachelor programs, UVM, the Vermont State Colleges, the privates, and we also work a lot with businesses. So for us, it's how do we help facilitate and bring all those resources to the table to serve students. As I think about from a provider perspective, CCV has, for 50 years, been all about access. It's how do we, this was the vision of Governor Dean Davis when he started this whole thing, was how do you take education to Vermonters in a very rural place? There's no, one of our biggest challenges is volume. How do you provide people in the Northeast Kingdom with the same opportunities that you could provide much easier in Chittenden County? It's always a challenge to out access. But I would say that the people in the Northeast Kingdom deserve as many opportunities as the people in Chittenden County. So how do you figure all of that out? And that's just a Vermont challenge because of the volume. But as we think about our working with adults, and when I think about adults, I think of whether they're 18 or 80. Because the students who come to CCV, if you talk to them, like, what are you doing these days? They would say, okay, I am working here. I'm the mother of 2. I do this, I do that. Oh, and by the way, I take courses. If you go to a traditional college and you talk to a student on campus and you say, what are you doing? Their first thing is, I'm a college student. Oh, and then there's the other things. So when I talk about adults, I'm referring to 18-year-olds as much as I am the 45-year-old. So when we think about adults and why don't they access education at the rate we would hope they would? And I want to make a caveat. While I work for a college and I believe college degrees open opportunities, I also am a believer that it's not always about college. It's about continuing your education. So we have to make a commitment here in Vermont that every kid who leaves high school needs to make a commitment to continue their education. I don't care if it's apprenticeship or if it's in the military or whatever, but it can't be I'm done learning. And so that's a piece that I think is really just really important. But when you think about why don't people continue their education, for us, it boils really down to 2 really simple things. It's time and money. And so how do you help people who are thinking that they really don't have the money to invest and they don't have the time? So how can we do that? So from a provider perspective, we've really been wrestling with this for a while, but we've really started to make some significant changes because for so long we have offered courses in a very traditional way. 15-week courses, once a week, twice a week, you go to school. If you are in one course, it's 3 credits, and at the end of 15 weeks, you have 3 credits. Well, if I'm an adult and I'm working on a degree, and our students, the majority of our students take 2 courses. So if I'm going to school and I'm taking 2 courses and I'm plodding along, it's 4 years before I get my degree. As an adult, that's an eternity. So we've really started to really think about that because it's an eternity, and it's 4 years before I get to realize any financial benefit from any of my investment. So thinking about that, the whole wave towards shorter-term credentials, and what does that mean? So we have been, in our work with businesses, and because we're all over the state and we're in 12 different locations, we do have the opportunity, and we take full advantage of it, to work really closely with businesses. What do they need? What are they looking for? So I'll give you an example. So we were working with some businesses, and they said to us, you know what, we don't need any more accountants. We need bookkeepers. And so thinking about, okay, bookkeepers don't need an associate degree. So there's nationally recognized credentials for bookkeepers. And you can put together 3 or 4 courses, and all of a sudden someone can take those courses and get a degree as a bookkeeper. What's key about and this goes to something that Scott was talking about the value of credentials. One of the things that we have been very careful about as we develop credentials is they're all nested within our degree programs. So, because I am a believer that, the majority of us, now there will always be a key role for traditional schools where the 18-year-old applies, they start, they're going to go to school full-time, and in 4 years they'll be done with a degree. And that is great for the student that it works for. But the majority of us, it's going to be in and out. I take some courses, I go to work, I get to a certain level, I'm passed over for a promotion, I can't go to the next level, I go back to school, I get something, I come back. I really think that is the future of the majority of the way we will continue our education. And so for us, when we develop credentials, it's really to respond to that. So if I take some courses, I can get a credential, I go out into the workplace, I can come back, or I can keep going. So that bookkeeper can keep going and get their accounting degree. They can get their CPA. They can do all of that, but they can also work. So credentials, I think, as we think about time and think about money for adults, they need to be able to work. And so being able to provide them with a quicker time to seeing those benefits is one way. I think another, and this is something that CCV has been in this business for a long time, the assessment of prior learning, where we have a lot of adults who have gained significant learning in their work experience. And I am a believer, I don't want to waste people's time or money. And so if you have been in banking and you have attended all kinds of American Banking Institute courses, and then you decide you want a degree, but you've already taken a lot of management courses, you've already taken a lot of supervision courses, why would we say to you, you need to take Introduction to Marketing or Introduction to Business? And so we have this course called the Assessment of Prior Learning course, where an adult can come take that course. It is an incredibly rigorous course. You put together a portfolio, and it then is reviewed by faculty, and we bring in faculty from all colleges throughout Vermont, both public and private, to review portfolios. And all of a sudden, an adult can start with 20 credits. Well, that is such a huge boost. If I'm an adult and all of a sudden I have 20 college credits, that gives me the courage I can continue. And what's wonderful, and I want to give a shout out to the McClure Foundation, in honor of our 50th anniversary, they have given us money for 50 scholarships for 50 adults to take the Assessment of Prior Learning course. Because what happens is we don't do enough to help people understand that they could go. I'm running out of my 5 minutes, right? Okay. So time is really critical. And the other side is money is really critical. And I'll just finish by saying, there's money for tuition, and then there's all the invisible costs. And when I think about a role for philanthropy, is really to think about how do we help address those invisible costs of going back to school. One of the ways that we have just recently done is we have created this, as a result of our 50th, our goal is to create a life gap endowment. We have found that by awarding students who are enrolled, if they run into a problem, all of a sudden they need new tires. Their car craps out. They have a child care issue. Our students do not have a safety net. And I would say a lot of Vermonters don't have a safety net. But we have found by awarding a student between $200 and $500, we can reverse them. That will be the difference between them continuing their education or dropping out. And the retention rate of the students that we have awarded those small grants to is phenomenal. And so we had a philanthropist who gave us $50,000 the first year, then upped it to $100,000 because it was so successful. And now we've decided to create an endowment, so it will continue. But so money is a huge challenge. It's not insurmountable, but we've got to pull together a lot of different resources to make it happen. So I'll stop there. I could talk forever on this topic. So
For now. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Joyce. And with the, of course, again in quotes, the employer perspective, joining us is Marianne Sheehan. She is the Executive Director of Vermont Talent Pipeline Management, an employer-led, data-driven process for filling the most critical jobs in the Vermont workforce. Mary Ann was trained in talent pipeline management by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and has experience in workforce development and credential systems. She's also a certified appreciative inquiry facilitator.
With Fran. Yes, we did that together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think when you introduced me, did you say that I was part of the Vermont Business Roundtable? I wasn't sure if that was part of this. Okay. So the Vermont Business Roundtable is a statewide organization, and they've actually hired me about 2 years ago. At the time, I was part of a network of the willing, which means I believed that the talent pipeline was a really good process. It's an implementation process, a system approach to collecting information from employers. And so they went out, I should say, Lisa Ventris, it's a very small organization, there's 3 of us, went out and did some fundraising to initiate this. So my role is actually working through the Vermont Business Roundtable Research and Education Foundation. And my work is really about employer research. So we are working in 3 industries, and those industries are construction, healthcare, and manufacturing. So I'd love to hear from our panel because all of the businesses that, well, not Clark's, but I'll just say a lot of businesses in our state are really actively involved in working together as collaboratives. So we have employers who get together and they decide which of their jobs. I'm a facilitator, really. I mean, I don't have any industry expertise in any of those fields, but I'm facilitating consensus on which of the jobs are the most critical in their industry. So after we identify that, we also do a forecast. So what you're looking at here is a pathways manual that McClure has produced, and that's information that comes from labor market projections. And so we actually start with that discussion saying, okay, here's what we're seeing in labor market projections. Let's figure out what it really looks like in Vermont. So we're asking them, what are the most critical jobs you need to fill to keep your business running or to grow so that our economy can keep going? After they identify that, they can say, okay, these are industry recognized credentials that we're willing to recognize because they fill these skill sets that we're looking for. And after we do that, we say, well, how are you willing to recognize them? So this is really the most important part, is that employers are willing to recognize these industry recognized credentials with incentives, like we're going to guarantee you an interview if you come to us with a certified production technician credential, or a LPN, or an LNA, or an RN. So we work very closely. My head has been bobbing this entire time. You can see me nodding when everyone spoke. I'm just going to say I work sort of on my own, but we have regional partnerships with local areas around the state. So we have somebody in Bennington and Brattleboro and Rutland and St. Johnsbury and St. Albans, down in Montpelier, and I'm in Chittenden County, but we're a statewide group. We work with everybody here. So Scott is actually the treasurer of the Vermont Business Roundtable. Joyce is on the steering committee for the talent pipeline. And I'll just say, Roxanne and I share thoughts every day. We're both working toward the same thing, which are really credentials for people to enter the labor force. So here we've connected some funding, some education, some business need, some real critical business need. But what's missing in all this is the labor force, right? So Roxanne gave a really great description of what our labor force looks like now because of demographic shift and a number of other things, educational costs and a variety of things. But if we had better communication about what's available to people, I think we could go a lot further. So I'll say we're working together. We could be working together better. We always can, you know. But if we had better communication to the labor force on how to enter, what are the on-ramps for people in construction? We have a credential. We guarantee you a wage above standard if you have completed this credential. We, you know, if you come, we have employers who have said, if you complete this certified production technician program, it's worth $2 to $5 an hour more than somebody who does not have it in that same role. So that's significant. We have, and I'm going to point out, like, the importance of those stackable credentials can't be undervalued, I'll just say. So we have this LNA program that's going on, and Rachel is working toward her LPN. So an LPN program in Vermont is offered by Vermont Tech. It's a one-year program, but it's pretty expensive. So to have an employer pay for it is great. I mean, that's a really great thing. Even better, though, only one more year, and you can get your RN. Okay, so now we're talking about a $15 an hour job as an LNA to a $24 an hour job average for an LPN, and a $34 an hour job as an RN. I mean, that's some real significant change. So I think, the discussion that we're having is really important. I heard someone use the term access before, and also want to point out that in order to get these folks, we're really talking about people who have graduated from high school. We need to be looking back at what's happening in early childhood. So for the folks from Let's Grow Kids, I'm just going to say kindergarten readiness is a big indicator of what's going to happen in the next few years. But fourth grade literacy has got to be one of the most critical points in our pathway. So if you've lost the ability, if you've stepped out because you can't read at fourth grade, you might be missing it by the time you get to eighth grade, and your math and reading skills are not going to make it. And then it's going to be hard for you. I'm sure there are correlations between the people who go to college and the people who have fourth grade literacy. So it matters all along the pathway. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now that I'm just going to ask one or two very quick questions, and I want questions from you. You've been sitting there for a long time. We also are hopeful that in the last half hour, we actually get you to work a little bit amongst each other. So all of you have brought up some solutions, some ideas. Some of the critical questions that I was asked to make sure to ask you is, one, where are the gaps? We've heard some things about how to get that 20% that we want, that extra 20%. That's difficult to get that last group of people. How do we give them more communications? We make better access. So there's that piece. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you are burning with about getting that from 50 to 70% for post-secondary attainment? I think we missed. Or do we move into where are the gaps for philanthropists? Okay. Bing, bing, bing. I'm going to move to gaps for philanthropists because that's who's here in the room.
I think we were so disciplined because you gave us our questions at the front. So we hit our talking points.
You certainly did, which is fantastic. So are there any gaps that you just want to really clarify? We're in a room with people who are looking to where is my money going to make the biggest difference?
Just say it again, communication. Communicating the need for these jobs to the labor force and putting together pathways for them that includes education and funding. I think is really important.
Great. And what about a systemic piece? What kind of systems need to be in place that are really going to support this kind of a new way of thinking? What are the systems that aren't in place now that are going to make a difference? Scott, I feel you have some things to say about that, but the rest of you might too, so go, Scott.
I'll go back to the communications and counseling piece. So as this area evolves, the complexity of it from the consumer perspective is increasing, not decreasing, both in terms of thinking about career and in terms of thinking about the education or training that's available. So we have a systems need both for traditional students to make sure that those career pathways that Marianne is talking about are readily available and communicated to them. But oftentimes we focus on that and forget that we have the same need at the adult level. So I can talk longer about how it is that we might approach that at some point, but we need that. We aren't providing good, solid career and education counseling at either end, and we will need to if we're going to meet these goals.
Joyce, and then Marianne.
I think that one of the biggest gaps that we have is that families are just simply taking themselves out of the college realm or out of continuing any form of education because the narrative in the media is that it's too expensive. You're going to graduate from college with $120,000, $150,000 in debt with no, it's just, there's no thinking. I'll tell a quick story. I had a couple years ago, I had a father call me from the Northeast Kingdom, and he was furious with CCV because his daughter was taking a dual enrollment course, and how dare we plant the seed that his daughter could go to college. And really it came down to two things. One, money, and one that he was afraid she would become educated and move away. And so there's some cultural things that are very real and very deep in Vermont that we have to talk about.
If I could play on that for just a second, just in terms of that, the cultural shift that has to take place around how we're perceiving these opportunities. So there has to be a common understanding between the public, employers, and education and training providers about what is needed, what is valuable. And we don't have that currently. So that has to happen. And then we have to have a unified campaign with consistent language and messaging around the value of those opportunities. So not just what's important because it's needed because you could get a job, but what is the greater return so that you don't get that question. And I think that there's a systems opportunity for that cultural shift.
Marianne. Thank you.
I'm not sure that this,
There we go.
there it is. When we do our research, we gathered data on how many new and replacement positions there are for each of the critical jobs. And we also gather information on employability skills, competencies, education requirements. And from that, you have basically a data set. But the data set itself doesn't mean that much to an educator. We're really doing this work so we can translate it for education. It doesn't mean that much without the employer narrative to go on the front of it. So actually storytelling, like this is what this data means, is a big piece of the missing communication. Like the reason that we need these things is because technology is changing. So now we don't need people to put a widget on anymore. We need people to operate a machine that puts a widget on. And we need them to repair that machine. Different things that go along with what a data set is all about.
A question just for the cameras. How do we get the influencers to get the story? How do they get the storyline, not just the data? Responses? Is that happening, and is that like a necessary thing?
I can't help but mention, again, Advanced Vermont is doing this public communications campaign in which we're going to take to the public stories of real Vermonters and the paths that they took and what it took to be successful in those paths. We're going to aim to educate the populace about what a non-degree pathway is, what an occupational license is for certain professions, what a registered apprenticeship is, and so on. And help to not just demystify, because, a lot of us just don't know, but also to destigmatize and make it accessible. Look at that. Hey, if you're coming out of the Advanced Welding Institute and you're making $50,000 a year or greater, that's a great opportunity. So we're looking to take the work of that campaign, which will be rolling out this spring, summer, and build it into this education, training, and employment portal that I talked about earlier, which is going to take the content from this Pathways to Promising Careers brochure and bring it to a greater audience. So give it more reach and bring it online with a host of resources that are attached to it and the ability to search information by geography, industry, median wage, and so on, number of openings, and so on. So hopefully the combination of this public communications campaign, and we need you to all get on board, by the way. This is not just us up here who are going to be doing this. We need everyone to adopt common language, get the message out there, shift the narrative, and then provide the public who now has more accurate information with a variety of resources so they can take action. It shouldn't be difficult, and you shouldn't need to know one of us to be able to access the information.
We just produced a video that our summer interns actually went out and they interviewed employees from a number of different construction companies, and they asked them what their education route that they took was, and then what they love about their job. And so they hit all the critical jobs in the construction industry, which for general contracting begins with a carpenter or craft professional, and then goes to a site superintendent or a crew leader, project manager, or a project engineer. So you can imagine the narrator of it was someone from PC Construction, and she said, construction may be a little different than what you think it is. And she said, it's a safe job. That's, we need people for it. It has great pay and all these things. And then they interviewed all these different people who said, I took classes 2 nights a week, and now I have my journeyman's license. And, and they're beautiful young people who are in a great industry, loving what they do. And it's not, it doesn't come across as, you have to go to college. It comes across as, I went to the Building and Trades program at Randolph. I went to the Building and Trades program at Hannaford. I studied engineering. And everybody has a different route, but they're talking about really great jobs. And, I think that that's a really good storytelling. We communicated that to all of the tech centers and all the people who offer construction programs, all the CTEs and principals. And I've gotten feedback from people, can you come and meet with our students? And I'm like, it's not really me. It's our employers who you want to meet with your students, so.
Marion, I totally agree. I think that one of the gaps is how do we help employers? Like if an employee, I oftentimes when I'm meeting with employers, I'll say, what would be a really wonderful gift to someone is when you're interviewing them and you're not offering them a job, tell them what they need to do, and then come back and interview, and I'll hire you. So I think somehow we have to help employers be more out there, because everyone expects me to talk about education. I mean, so, it's like, okay, yeah, here she goes again. But I think hearing from a farmer, hearing from someone in manufacturing, hearing from whoever about the skills that they're looking for is critical.
Thank you. Another burning question right here, and then we'll get to you.
Scott, you were talking about the 70% figure, that it breaks down 40% projected to need a 4-year degree and 30% another credential. Do you have a sense of how the gap breaks down? Does it live equally in kind of both places? Are we doing a better job in one of those areas than the other?
Boy, that's a really good question. And there's an equity issue embedded in there that I would be remiss if I didn't bring up because we haven't talked about it yet. And that is that we need to support multiple pathways for folks, but we also know that certain outcomes, certain degrees, for better or worse on average, yield different results than credentials of value over time. That's not that a degree is right for every student. It's just that we need to acknowledge that there's an equity issue embedded. And the recession made it really, really clear how deep that equity challenge was. Because during the recession, I'm trying to remember, I'm going to get my numbers wrong, but we lost, I'm going to say something in the nature of 5.8 million jobs held by individuals with a high school diploma or less. Only 80,000 of those came back. 1.8 million jobs were lost by folks with an associate's degree. Those all came back after the recession. In fact, 3.1 million jobs were created for individuals with associate's degrees. For bachelor's degrees, as hard as the economy was, there was a net gain of 66,000 jobs. And for those with graduate programs, there were 253,000 jobs that were added during the height of the recession. And of the 11.8 million jobs that came back, almost 10 million of those went to folks that had a degree. So, it's just something as we think about these pathways that we have to bear in mind. And that's why, for me, I'll get passionate about stackability. That by having a system that creates an either-or choice for the students of all ages that we are trying to support is just the wrong systems approach to this. And that's my best answer to your question, because I think that over time, we need to help individuals be able to move in and out of these different positions and obtain the credential they need for where they are at that place, and not think about it solely in terms of a fixed percentage that we need in this grouping. Does that make sense?
Yep. Well, Joyce won't say this, so I'll say it for her. But a lot of the programs that CCV puts together involve, for instance, the Certified Production Technician. That's actually a 6-credit course, and it applies to a degree. So I want to make sure that anything that our employers are recognizing is a stackable program that applies to a degree eventually.
And what's nice about the CPT program is it actually, yes, they can come and do a program at CCV, but it also leads to the engineering program at Vermont Tech. So we can get them in the door and get them started, but if they really aspire to an engineering program, they can do that at Vermont Tech. So our goal is to help them get started, whatever, and then go wherever they want.
Same thing with what Rachel's doing right now. So she's taking her I'm assuming 4 classes in preparation for the LPN program through CCV. And then it's actually part of the first, I'm going to say 15 credits maybe of the 36 that you need.
Yes, it's the prerequisite.
Right.
One thing
good.
we haven't talked about today, I think that, and it falls in line with what the governor talked about yesterday in his speech about increasing apprenticeships. So I think another piece that's really critical for adults, again, whether you're 18 or 45, is the ability to be able to learn and earn at the same time. And I think, for us in Vermont, we've gotten really comfortable. We know when we hear apprenticeships, we think electrical and plumbing. But there are so many more opportunities for apprenticeships. I'll give you, we just last fall started a pharmacy tech apprenticeship program because we were approached by CVS because they have so many openings in Vermont and they need pharmacy tech. So so we provide the educational component, the pharmacies provide the job. And so so adults can be working in a pharmacy, they can be taking their courses and then end up with a credential and then more pay, and it just keeps going. So apprenticeships, I think what the governor recommended yesterday makes total sense for Vermont, and I hope we can, because there are many, many apprenticeships beyond electrical and plumbing.
A quick one, and then I want to see what we're going to do as a group. Go ahead, Scott.
No, the only thing I wanted to add on the apprenticeship side is that there are financing issues associated with that are similar to what we are dealing with in other credentials of value. Tools, just as an example in some contexts. So there's a ripe opportunity for us to think differently about how we finance these. And I mention this just because oftentimes people hear apprenticeships and think that this is a self-funded program, and they're not entirely.
They're not. Okay, thank you.